Selamat pagi, selamat siang kawan-kawan sekalian, and good afternoon from, good morning from Indonesia. Profesor Ras, hari ini kita akan berdiskusi mengenai perdagangan madat di Jawa dan Asia Tenggara bersama seorang pakar yang karyanya juga terpampang dalam salah satu bagian dari Cornell's Modern Indonesia Collection. Perkenalkan pemateri kita hari ini, Profesor James Robert Rush. Beliau adalah profesor sejarah di Arizona State University, Amerika Serikat. Beliau meraih gelar sarjana di Gettysburg College tahun 1966. Gelar magisternya didapat tahun 1972, serta gelar doktornya diraihnya pada tahun 1977. Keduanya dari Yale University, dan beliau pernah menjadi sukarelawan Peace Corps di Malaysia. Selama karirnya di dunia akademis, beliau pernah menjadi Direktur Program Studi Asia Tenggara di Arizona State University, dan sekarang menjadi Direktur Center for Asian Research di universitas yang sama. Profesor Rush juga pernah menjadi konsultan untuk Rockefeller Brothers Fund di Asia Society dan El Colegio de Mexico. Beliau adalah penulis buku ternama Opium to Java, Revenue Farming and Chinese Enterprise in Colonial Indonesia, 1816 to 1910, yang diterbitkan pertama kali oleh Cornell University Press dalam bahasa Inggris pada tahun 1990. Buku ini lalu diterjemahkan ke dalam bahasa Indonesia pertama kali oleh penerbit Mata Bangsa pada tahun 2000. Di tahun 2007, edisi bahasa Inggrisnya diterbitkan ulang oleh Equinox Publishing di Jakarta, sementara edisi paling mutakhir dari bahasa Indonesia yang terbaru diterbitkan oleh Komunitas Bambu dengan judul Candu Tempo Doeloe, Pemerintah, Pengedar, dan Pecandu 1860-1910 yang terbit pada tahun 2012. Buku ini bisa didapatkan dengan merogoh kocek sebesar 95.000 ya kawan-kawan, dan bisa dipesan langsung di website Kobam atau Instagram @bukukobam. Buku lain yang pernah ditulis Profesor James Rush adalah Southeast Asia, A Very Short Introduction, lalu Hamka's Great Story, A Master Writer's Vision of Islam for Modern Indonesia, dan The Last Three, Reclaiming the Environment in Tropical Asia. Okay. Thank you for giving your time to have discussion with us, Professor Rush. And
you're welcome.
Time is yours, sir.
Oh, thank you. So I hope English is okay. Is that all right?
Yes, it's okay, sir.
All right. Thank you. So I didn't prepare any formal remarks because I thought we would probably be having a discussion. I'd like to hear your questions or your interests in my book about opium, but I can give you a brief background. I started studying this many years ago because I was a student of Indonesian history, also a student of colonial history, and I discovered that almost no historian, and especially no Dutch historians, ever mentioned the topic of opium. And yet, as I discovered, opium was a very important part of the Dutch colonial revenue system. And in fact, as I learned, it was a critical part of the whole colonial culture, especially in the mid and late 19th century in Java and other parts of Indonesia. So I went about exploring this in the Dutch archives mainly. And on the basis of that, I developed what was at first a PhD dissertation and later this book, Opium to Java. And my real interest in this wasn't really opium, although opium is pretty interesting. Madat is pretty interesting. But I studied this with the intention of trying to understand Indonesian society, and especially colonial Indonesian society in the 19th century. And indeed, it turns out that you can learn a lot about the nature of the Dutch administration in Java, the nature of the Dutch colonial bureaucracy, but also the Javanese bureaucracy, and also this burgeoning important community of overseas Chinese who were living in Java and other parts of Indonesia at the time. So much about these big topics can be explored through the simple topic of opium in Java. And so that's really what my book is about. It talks about the nature of the opium farming system, the opium pacht, about the role of wealthy Chinese merchants, especially Chinese officers, in the opium farm system. It talks about how the Dutch managed this system so that they could create very large revenues for themselves, right? It talks about the institutions that surround the opium farm system and the society that emerged around it. And then it talks about the crisis that occurred in the late 19th century, during which, for a variety of economic reasons, the opium farm system came under attack, and also for a variety of reasons having to do with ethical objections, especially among the Dutch, to opium farming, that the Dutch eventually decided that they needed to abandon this system and pursue a new one that was more ethical. And so my book ends with the dismantling or breaking apart of the opium farm system and the creation of this new system called the opium regie, that was, in the eyes of the Dutch in the early 20th century, far more ethical. And that's more or less how the book ends. And so that's all I want to say by way of introduction, and I would be eager to have your questions or impressions.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. So actually I have several questions with this small problem. So the first thing is, I've been thinking, why the opium trade? So I've just read your book, I got the old version of the Indonesian.
Yes.
So why the opium trade was dominated by the Chinese?
It was dominated by the Chinese because of the system that the Dutch used to raise money by selling opium. So this was what we call opium farming. But as you know, if you've read the book, nobody ever grew opium in Java. It was all imported, right? It was imported mainly from India, but from other places too. The Dutch monopolized importing opium to Java and to other parts of the Indies. But to make it easy on themselves, they used this system of revenue farming to make money by selling opium. And to do this, they held auctions. And in these auctions, people bid for what today we would call a franchise to sell opium in certain districts. And these districts were usually residencies, today's provinces, but sometimes they were smaller, but usually residencies. And for a variety of reasons, Chinese merchants were the ones who were best positioned to compete for these the opium farms, for these businesses, or like mini monopolies for selling opium. And they were in this position because of the particular role that they played, especially in the beginning in the north coast cities of Java, as merchants and entrepreneurs and economic middlemen between the Dutch and the Priai and others, producers, farmers in particular, in the economy of Java. So they were the ones who most often competed with each other to purchase really these franchises for a limited period of time, 1 year, 5 years, it depended. But they were not exclusively involved in this. There were other Europeans who sometimes competed for opium farms, but that was rare. So for the most part, the people who competed for these farms were local Chinese men or Peranakan men.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, for the other question is that why the Dutch choose to, I know, maybe the Dutch or the Chinese, yeah? Why the Dutch choose to, auction the opium in Indonesia?
Why did they choose to do that?
Yeah.
They auctioned off many things. So there were lots of farms, right? So the Dutch also auctioned off farms to control and run markets, right? All over the Dutch East Indies, but particularly in Java. They auctioned off the right to collect tolls, say for crossing rivers and things like that. In many places, they auctioned off the privilege of operating butcher shops, and in some places for collecting birds' nests. All kinds of things were farmed out to people. And the Dutch did this because it was a very easy way for them to make money without having to do the work themselves, right? So if you auction off the right, for example, to collect taxes, all sorts of taxes, your officials don't have to collect those taxes. Somebody else collects them for you and delivers to you a sum of money, right? And so the Dutch wanted the sum of money and to get it in the easiest way they possibly could. And they did this by using this device called a revenue farm, right? So opium was only one of these. This meant that the Dutch could wash their hands of the business of doing all of these things themselves. They could get the money because they had sold the rights to franchise this activity. And then they could look the other way, if you know that expression, while the taxes were collected and the opium was sold and so forth. So for them, it was almost a perfect system, right? So that's why they did it. And they didn't invent this. This is a device for collecting taxes and revenues that had been used all over the world in various kingdoms and empires and so forth. Southeast Asian kings had done it before the Dutch, right? Like the Sultan of Malacca and important figures like that. So they didn't invent this, but it was a highly useful system for them to use. The Dutch were interested in the revenue, right? They were interested in the money flowing in. And so that's why they did it. Eventually, they abandoned it because critics of the system came to feel that it could be abusive, right? And indeed, revenue farms are kind of they're very highly subject to abuses, because if the king or the Dutch colonial administration is not looking, all kinds of bad things can happen, and especially brutality in the collection of taxes or other kinds of anomalies, we would say, in things like selling opium, for example. So that's why they did it this way. And eventually, by the beginning of the 20th century, they had abandoned it. And it's very interesting what they did next. What they did next was set up a government agency in which the Dutch sold opium themselves. So the reform that occurred under the ethical policy in the Dutch East Indies was to remove the Chinese from the opium business and to bring, it wasn't really the Dutch, but it was Indonesian officials who worked for the Dutch as part of the Pangre Praja, the whole ladder of bupatis and wadonos and assistant wadonos and et cetera, and had them manage the business of selling opium through a new agency, a new colonial agency.
Okay, sir. So after that, I'm thinking about, can you explain a bit more about the mechanism of this opium trade and revenue farming, sir?
I'll describe the main parts and then you can maybe ask specific questions, okay?
Okay.
So basically it worked like this. The Dutch purchased the opium from the British and others, right? And they imported it into Batavia, basically. And from there, they distributed it to the residencies, right? Where it was provided to the opium farmers, right? The opium farmers, in essence, bought it from the Dutch, right? At a fixed price. And then they had elaborate, very large businesses that they established called opium farms that they used to sell the opium all the way down to individual villages. So these, the opium farms were very complicated business organizations. And they were also very complicated social organizations because they included not only Chinese opium merchants, but a variety of indigenous Javanese and other players who were involved in the lower tiers of the opium farm. So that's really how they did it. The Dutch import the opium, they sell it to the opium farmers, the farmers sell it throughout their districts. So the farmers, for example, had extensive number of individual stores. They had individuals who went from village to village and were kind of selling out of hand. They had factories where they manufactured the opium and converted the raw opium into products because there were a whole range of products that people could buy. And most of these were like very, very tiny packets of Madat, very, very tiny ones that people would either mix with tobacco and smoke, or some people would put it in tea or coffee and drink. Some people with more money would go to the opium den and smoke it in a pipe, right? But this was already a larger quantity. So this wasn't the main way that most people used opium, but that was kind of the and more upscale kind of way of using opium. And so the opium farms tried to control this whole network of distribution, from the top to the bottom. Why don't you ask a specific question, then I can say more.
Okay, yeah. So you say that the Dutch purchased opium from the British. Why didn't the Dutch purchase it directly from maybe Bengal or other places?
Because Bengal, when I say the British, I mean Bengal. So the British owned Bengal. Bengal was a colonial territory of Britain. It was part of the British colony in India. So it was Bengal opium mainly, right? but Britain and British merchants, British private merchants controlled the trade of Bengal opium. Opium was also grown in other parts of India. It was also grown in the Middle East, in places today that are like around Lebanon. There were a variety of sources, but the vast majority of the opium that the Dutch purchased to distribute to their subjects in Indonesia was Indian opium, and Britain controlled the Indian opium market. So they, for example, a lot of these exchanges didn't occur in India, they occurred in Singapore. When Singapore was founded in 1819, and so Singapore became the probably most important region-wide distribution center for opium, for British opium in all of Southeast Asia. And so all kinds of private merchants, mainly British ones, but all kinds of others too, indigenous Southeast Asians, Arab merchants were buying opium in Singapore and trading it all over Indonesia. To Bali, famously, for example.
I see. So after the Dutch buy it from the British and send it to Batavia, they auction it to the Chinese.
Yes.
The Chinese sell it to the district by opening stores.
Yes.
Is there any mechanism? You may go ahead. Is there any mechanism other than selling it at the stores?
Oh, there were lots of different things. So the stores were the visible part, right? So opium farms were, the Dutch had rules for these franchises. So you're only allowed to have so many stores, and you're only allowed to sell so much at any one time, and so forth. But these rules were universally broken. Right? And so you've got a store or a bunch of stores. These might be in regional centers. There would be stores at the Kabupaten, for example, and then at the Kawadanaan and then farther down. But there were also, as I was mentioning, there were lots of what the Dutch considered to be illegal places where smaller amounts of opium were sold by sometimes you might call them independent operators, but people who would go to the opium store and buy, this much, they break it down into smaller pieces, and they'd go around from village to village and sell it in small bits. It's a little bit like, in modern Indonesia, everywhere in Southeast Asia, actually, at least places I've been, people sell cigarettes by the cigarette, right? You're on the street, you're driving down the street, you pull up, there's a guy who's selling cigarettes by the stick, right? Does that still happen in Indonesia?
Yes.
Okay, so it happens in Manila, every place I've been. So opium was like that. So a person would buy a big bunch and break it down into little things, smaller pieces and smaller products, and then that way, an ordinary farmer or somebody without much money, which would be the ordinary person, okay, could buy some opium, and in little bits. This was the most interesting thing I learned, I think, about this, is that we all have these images of people lying in opium dens, smoking opium pipes, and spending all day long smoking opium. Only certain rich people could do that. So bupatis and priai who were opium smokers could do that. Wealthy Chinese could do that. But most people, probably if they smoked opium at all, smoked just a little bit at the end of the day after they finished their hard work. So for that reason, most of the Javanese, for example, who smoked opium, were not very addicted to it. Maybe only a little bit, but they could never afford to smoke enough opium to become totally dependent, right? So it was a kind of interesting social practice that many people engaged in, but that is different from the kind of image that we have about opium smoking.
I see, sir. So there is this question from chat. There is this question from Kandis Ghazi. Why the Dutch sell opium, not other kind of drugs like cannabis?
So that's a good question. And I think the answer is that I'm not sure how much the Dutch knew about cannabis or whether they would have been interested in cannabis. Cannabis, for example, grows wild all around Southeast Asia. I'm sure it grows wild in Indonesia. The Dutch would not have been interested in that because they were interested in a product that they could monopolize and control. I don't think they could have done that with cannabis. So in the 19th century, and in fact, from about the 1400s and 1500s, 1600s, morphine was the preferred drug of pleasure, right? It's called a drug of pleasure, morphine, which comes from opium poppies. And although opium later was grown all over Asia, and especially in China, during this period, it was only grown in certain places. And the Dutch tried to grow it in Java, but Java doesn't have the right climate for opium, evidently. At least that's what the Dutch decided. And so opium was much better than something like cannabis, which grows everywhere and can't be easily controlled. So some of the other things that we now know about are modern derivatives of morphine. So by the early 20th century, okay?
Yes, sir, yes.
Okay, so by the beginning of the 20th century, in addition to kind of old-fashioned smoking of opium, there were morphine pills and all kinds of other new drugs coming into Indonesia, all of which the Dutch outlawed. They were contraband, and they tried very hard to suppress the distribution of these modern drugs, because the modern drugs are much more powerful, number one. So you will know that you go from morphine to heroin. So heroin is a highly processed morphine. It comes from opium, but eventually through chemistry, it's made into this much more powerful drug. And that's a modern invention, right? And so it doesn't really come into play during this period of the opium farms and so forth. But by the early 20th century, the Dutch were dealing with that. The place, in India, for example, there were a lot of people who were smoking hashish and things like that. That was a popular kind of drug. But I never encountered that in Indonesia. I never encountered it in all the Dutch writings and investigations. They did all kinds of studies about opium, and it rarely comes up.
I see. Okay, so we go to another question. So there is this question from Sulkhan Zuhdi, and this is my friend.
Okay.
The opium uses for something religiously or spiritually in Javanese people?
So the answer to that one is I don't know. In my research, right, I did not encounter that. So keep in mind that my research about this was done almost entirely through Dutch records, Dutch observations. Some of the material was in Malay, right? And there were interviews with people and so forth and so on. But I personally didn't encounter any any significant connection between using opium and, for example, mantras or trances and things like that that might be religious, might be connected to religious practice. So I didn't find that.
Okay, so there is Agentono raise hand. So, monggo, Agentono untuk menyampaikan pertanyaannya langsung. I don't know whether that is still on. Mas Agentono. So maybe it was not online. So I go to another question, if I may. So, yeah, I remember that. Udah kembali Mas Agiantono.
Enggak. Tadi kepencet anak saya ini. Maaf.
Oh ya, okay.
Saya mendengarkan aja.
Okay. So, Prof. James Rush, what is the connection between opium trade and revenue farming, if I may ask?
Well, it's the same. So revenue farming is the system that I was describing a few minutes ago, whereby the state, in this case, the Dutch colonial state, but it could be a kingdom or whatever. Revenue farming is farming out the, you might call it the privilege for collecting taxes, right? On behalf of the state, right? So as I was explaining, the Dutch used the revenue farming system to raise all kinds of money by having other people collect that money for them, right? By charging tolls on roads and for cross rivers and so forth. And so opium farming is revenue farming. Did I understand the question?
Okay. So I have some other questions. There is this. Mas Bustami menggugat mau bertanya. Monggo Mas, silakan.
Oke, tapi nggak pakai kamera nggak apa-apa Mas ya? Soalnya lagi.
Oh, silakan.
Okay, thank you for Mr. James. I'm interested in the period you doing your research between 1860 up to 1910.
Yes.
Why you choose the period and what happened after 1910s in Java related with the trading of opium?
Yes.
Why you stop the period just only on 1910? Why there is something happens, for example, like, or maybe there is another reason why you took the period to tell us, or maybe write the books based on your research, because sometimes a writer have a strong reason, for example, like why we have to take some period, not in another period, because I do interesting in what happened after 1910 in the opium trading in Java, of course, or in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. So in a way, the years of my research were arbitrary, but in another way, they weren't. So what I was really interested, the story I was interested in telling was the story of this kind of peak of this practice of opium farming in Java, the peak of the influence and wealth of a certain generation or two of opium farmers who were also Chinese officers and extremely important and wealthy individuals in Java during that period. and the end of that period, right? So by 1910, the revenue farming system has been abandoned. There were no more opium farms. There were no more opium farmers. And the Dutch were very quickly also marginalizing the Chinese officers who were figures of great influence in the 19th century, but by 1910 were not anymore. And so there was a huge kind of political, but also cultural shift that occurred in this period between 1860 and 1910, right? So by 1910, the revenue farming system was gone, and the new system established under the Dutch ethical policy, which I'm sure you know about, was in place. And this was the opium regime, right? And by 1910, this new institution that the Dutch had established, the opium regime, was very strong. And in fact, it was making lots of money for the Dutch. Right? So 1910 is in a way arbitrary, but it marks the end of the old days, right? And the beginning of new days. By 1910, the ethical policy had come into place. The Chinese officers, the former families and clans who had been opium farmers, were morphing into new kinds of business people in Indonesia, abandoning the opium business and going into new things, new kinds of enterprises, sugar and shipping and all kinds of big enterprises and so forth. And then to address your question about what happens next, it's fascinating because the Dutch were getting nervous about selling opium. In Holland, there was a huge number of people, call them NGOs, who were campaigning against opium and who wanted the Dutch government to stop selling opium altogether because they believed it to be an immoral business, right? That there was something wrong about selling opium to people, and especially there was something wrong about selling opium to people in order to raise money from your subjects. Right? So this was very hotly debated in the Netherlands, and eventually the anti-opium group won this argument. And so between 1910 and 1942, the end of the Dutch regime, the Dutch administration began selling less and less and less and less opium. They didn't stop altogether, but they started to crimp the amount of opium that was for sale because they had come to believe that selling opium to their subjects was not a good idea, right? And at the same time, many Indonesians, so because by this time you have Syarikat Islam and you have Muhammadiyah, you have all sorts of Indonesian groups who are emerging, modern Indonesian NGOs who are also campaigning against opium because they also believed, of course, that opium was not a good thing. And so all of these forces came together so that by the late 1930s, the opium business in Java had become very small, right? It wasn't altogether gone. It was completely in the hands of the Dutch and this Dutch agency, but it was withering away, right? And so that's how things stood when the Japanese armies arrived in the spring of 1942. So all kinds of interesting things happened in this period between 1910 and let's just say between then and the revolution of the late 1940s.
Oke, Mas Bustomi, mungkin ada tanggapan atau pertanyaan?
Ya, cukup. Thank you, Mr. James.
Okay. So, there another question from Faricha. Did the Dutch ever face opposition from the Bupati about the opium farming and distribution in the region? And how is the profit sharing between the Dutch and Bupati, if there is any?
Yeah, that's another very interesting question. I did not encounter in the 20th century, with the emergence of the modern Perdagangan organizations in Indonesia, people did push back against selling opium, push back against the Dutch. But during the period that I studied, I didn't encounter Bupatis who objected. I think one of the things that we have to remember as 21st century people is that opium was completely legal in Dutch Java, and it was legal in most of the world, right? So the opium farmers, the people who were selling opium to the people, were not breaking the law. They were part of the law. They were part of the government, and the government was using opium as a way to raise revenue. People thought about it in exactly the same way that people think today about taxes on cigarettes, right? Is it okay to impose a tax on cigarettes and have the government make lots of money from that? Well, most countries do it, right? So it's called a vice tax. People feel, well, cigarettes are really not good for you, but if people want to buy them, let's tax it, right? Well, revenue farm was a way of taxing opium use, but also of expanding it and promoting it through these opium farms. So I didn't encounter any objections from Priai about opium, right? How were the Priai involved in this? They were involved in the same way that many Dutch officials were involved, as being complicit in the opium farms, right? So, for example, the opium farms required police. The opium farms required assistance from the administration of the Bupatis and the Wadonos and even Luras and so forth. They required the assistance of these people in policing their monopolies, because they were supposed to have monopolies, right? But there was tons of smuggling going on. And so there was kind of this war going on in most places between people selling the legal opium, right, and illegal opium. And so the farmers had to have the assistance of the administration, which was almost wholly in Javanese hands, in order to police their monopolies. And as a reward for their assistance, they received gifts, tanda hormat, sumbangan, and other things from the opium farmers, assistance for their help in policing their opium farms, their franchises, right? And so there was a complicity. This is very well documented between Bupati and other Priai officials on the one hand, and opium farmers on the other. The Dutch were also in on this. Dutch officials, also residents, for example, and assistant residents. These were the two top Dutch officials in every residency. They also were complicit in the system. And the opium farmers provided them with all kinds of gifts and presents and rewards for looking the other way in some cases, or for assisting them in one way or another. Keep in mind that the opium farmers were part of big businesses. Opium farmers were not just opium farmers. They were the patronage leaders for huge networks of Chinese businesses of all kinds. So they tended to be the senior business people in every single region. Opium was only one of their businesses, but it was a core business because it was official, right? And so as figures who needed help from the authorities, opium farmers provided all kinds of nice things to Dutch officials and to Javanese ones. So this was a system in which many people profited, right? Many people profited. So another example of this is almost all of these leading Peranakan business people who were opium farmers employed Dutch lawyers, right? So a lot of the most famous Dutch legal personnel in the Dutch East Indies worked for these people and handled their bankruptcy cases, for example. And they often got involved in civil suits where they were suing each other, or smuggling cases, all kinds of things, right? And so the Dutch officials were involved, Dutch private lawyers were involved, bupatis all over the place were involved, and their underlings in the priai hierarchy, and so on. So for them, for this elite group of actors in colonial Java, opium farms were a boon because they were making money for everybody.
I see. Okay. So you said about smuggling opium, the illegal ones.
Yes.
I remember that in your book that there are many opium smuggling business in Java, maybe more about the illegal ones rather than the legal ones.
Yes. Yeah.
Would you mind explaining to us about the mechanism of opium smuggling business in Java?
So I wish I could explain it all, but so think of it this way. Think of the coastline of Java, right? What's it like? There are 1,000 places along the coastline of Java where you can land a boat and take it up a river and bring in anything, right? Okay, so that's number one. Number two, there was a lot of opium all over Southeast Asia, right? So I mentioned that most of this opium came originally from Britain, and then it went to Singapore, but then from Singapore, it went everywhere. And so there were, in certain parts of Bali, there were big opium merchant sites, right? The Rajas of Bali were involved in opium business. There were opium farmers in Bali because some parts of Bali were under Dutch administration, some parts of Bali were not. But Bali was just one part of it. All throughout Southeast Asia, which was not thoroughly colonized during this period, there was opium for sale, right? And so it was pretty easy for people who wanted to purchase opium somewhere. Let's say the easiest place would be Singapore, but let's say Bali, and then smuggle it into Java, right? We know from the Dutch records that a lot of people did this undetected because it was not possible to patrol the coast, even when the Dutch tried very hard to do it. And they set up a whole system, a whole agency to patrol the coast of Java to keep illegal opium out. They failed. They couldn't do it. So this is why the police structure of the opium farms was so important, because the opium farms had their own network of Chinese who were running opium shops. They had a network of Javanese and others who were their mata-mata, their spies, who were here and there around the villages. And their job was to find out who was selling illegal opium and to get them arrested, or to bully them to stop, or to in some way intervene, right? And this was going on all the time. And it's why the opium farmers needed the help of the Javanese government, right? All of these officials who were had policing functions, who had policing functions. So that's part of it. But some of it was much more organized than this sounds. And this has to do with the fact that the opium farmers that we're talking about, these Peranakan elite business people, were in competition with each other, right? So every time there was an opium farm auction, they would compete with each other. Sometimes this one would win, sometimes that one would win. And so this means that opium farms were every now and then changing hands. If you're with me, they were changing hands, all right? What happens then, all right? So winner of the opium farm, he's the official opium farmer now, so he gets the whole franchise, and he probably, hires a lot of the employees of the old opium farm, brings them into his system, and now he's running it, trying to keep the other guy out. But the other guy has every interest in undermining this one and kind of moving his people and illegal opium into the system, if you follow me, right? So some opium smuggling was just kind of random, chaotic, individual commercial competition. Some of it had to do with what in my book I call the Battle of the Kings, where one Kangxi, one group, is in competition with another group, and one of their weapons is to infiltrate each other's franchise with illegal opium. So that was a big part of the smuggling also.
Oh, I see. So there is this question from Isa. Was there any attempt to sell opium in other region than that of Java and Bali? And also, is it exported to other Dutch trading partners?
Opium was for sale everywhere. So in the places where the Dutch had already established colonial power, they set up opium farms just like they did in Java. This is what happened in Bali. This happened in certain parts of Borneo where the Dutch had established colonial authority. As you know, during this same period, this is the period when the Dutch were going around the Indonesian archipelago and conquering individual states and small kingdoms. And usually right after they conquered somebody, they moved an opium farm in. So opium was for sale everywhere, but not just in colonial territories. It was for sale in non-colonized territories too. And in those areas, it would have been controlled by the Raja or the Sultans or their Shahbandars or others. Sometimes these kings also had collaborative relationships with Chinese or Arab business people who handled the opium business. So I'm afraid to say that opium was pretty ubiquitous in Southeast Asia during this time. There were parts of Java where opium selling was illegal. So the Dutch sequestered certain places and did not permit opium farms to operate. One of these places was in West Java, in Priangan, right? Because for a variety of reasons, the Dutch decided they just didn't want opium to be for sale there. So they had rules against that, and there were no opium farms there. But this also failed because they knew, eventually the Dutch knew that there were lots of places in Priangan where opium was easily available. So the answer is during this period between 1860 and 1910, and up until the Second World War, opium was pretty widely available everywhere. So there were opium farms of this kind in French Indochina. The French also sold opium in the same way. The Spanish also did in the Philippines. The Americans did for a little while, not very long, but they did. The British made even more money from opium than the Dutch did in Singapore and in Malaya.
Wow, I see. So when you said about the opium trade in Southeast Asia, is there any particular area other than West Java and Priangan, especially in Southeast Asia, that is free from opium trade?
No, no. So I wish I could remember the name of this place. There was a town, a district in Java that on its own refused it, just out and out refused it, and did not permit opium farmers or any opium to be sold there. But that was very rare, right? But I should say something else that might not be clear, and that is that it makes it sound, I make it sound, you probably are thinking that everybody was smoking opium, but that wasn't true. Probably about 20% of the people in certain areas were smoking opium, and those areas would have been Central Java and East Java and Bali. Those were in Indonesia, those were the high concentration areas, and then less so in other places. So 20% is a lot less than the majority of the people, right? But 20% of the population of Java is still millions of people. And so this is why the opium farms raised tons of money for the Dutch. So it wasn't the case that everybody was using opium at all. And as I mentioned before, it was the case that most of the people who did use opium used it in very small amounts, like tiny bits a day and so forth. And so this is one of the reasons that some Dutch said, well, this isn't so bad, right? This isn't so bad, right? Because it's not leading to the moral destruction of a people. People are just taking it because it makes them feel good at the end of a long day's work, that kind of thing. And that seems to be the fact that very few people used a lot of opium seems to be true. I found that to be factual to the best of my research, right? And so demographically, only a certain percentage of people smoked. A significant enough number that this whole business was built around them, but certainly not everybody.
Ah, I see. So there another question. Was opium was also sold to Europe, just like it is sold to Southeast Asia?
So Europeans.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is so interesting. So if we're talking about Dutch Europeans, the Dutch, very few Dutch became opium smokers that we know about. They were drinkers. Yeah, they were drinkers. So they were notorious for drinking a lot of gin and other things like that, spirits. But documented cases of Dutch opium addicts, Dutch opium users, are pretty small. I think there was a huge amount of peer pressure among the Dutch not to do this. So that seems to be true. Not many British became opium users either. The ones who did were French. And in French Indochina, in Vietnam, evidently many French people became involved with, went to the opium dens and everything else. So I don't have an explanation for this, but that seems to be true. And so there are some documented cases of opium smoking among Indos, right? It's the Eurasians, Dutch Indonesian people, but that was demographically, that was a pretty small group at the time.
I see. Okay, then let me ask. Was there any other question from participant? Okay. Oh, see. Okay, maybe it's been an hour of discussion. So I see there are no other questions from the participant. Maybe I would say one last question, maybe a formal question. How the opium and revenue farming ended?
Yes, so the revenue farming ended before the opium. So I mentioned that in Holland, there developed a group of people who objected very much to the fact that the Dutch were selling opium to their subjects. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with the great novel Max Havelaar and how it inspired many Dutch people to believe that the Dutch needed to reform the way they ran their colonies, and especially in Indonesia. And so there was a big campaign to bring an end to the opium farms that reached its peak in the 1890s. And this was something that was debated in the Netherlands, in the Dutch parliament. And eventually the Dutch government, the Dutch parliament, decided to abandon the revenue farming system, and especially the opium farms. But a lot of other revenue farms eventually were abandoned as well in the early 20th century as part of this big change. So this was, if you are interested in like the history of bureaucracies and so forth, this was a time when many governments were moving away from what you might call indirect methods of governance to direct methods of governance. So in this case, instead of collecting revenues from opium through a farm, through your Chinese revenue farmers, we're going to collect them directly, right? And so the revenue, the opium farms ended and were replaced by an agency where Indonesians, other subjects of the Dutch, could go to the store and buy opium from the government. That's what it was. So that was the first change. So that's the end of the revenue farm part. But this opium part is still there. And then the next part is what I was talking about a little while ago. And that is that the pressure that the Dutch government was under from people in Holland to bring an end to the opium business in the colony, and also new pressure from Indonesians who are in their mass organizations are also pressuring the Dutch to stop this. They eventually almost do, right? So they're in the process of winding it all down when the colony itself came to an end, when the Japanese invaded in 1942. So that's how it all came to an end. And of course, the new Indonesian government did not engage in any of these practices. And so that all became history. And so, of course, it did not bring an end to opium in Indonesia or other kinds of drugs in Indonesia, but all of this in the new history of Indonesia became part of the underworld of drug trafficking and so forth, no longer a public business.
Okay. So let me try to conclude the discussion for today. Bagi kawan-kawan tadi, terima kasih untuk yang sudah hadir. Jadi kali ini kita mendiskusikan bersama Prof. James Ras tentang opium and revenue farming. Di awal diskusi tadi, Prof. James sudah menjelaskan sedikit tentang bagaimana pada awalnya orang-orang Belanda ini membeli opium dari orang Inggris, bukan orang Inggris, dari wilayah jajahan Inggris, Bengal, lalu mengirimnya ke Batavia, lalu menjualnya, atau bukan menjual, lebih tepatnya melelangnya kepada orang-orang tertentu, kebanyakan bandar-bandar Tionghoa, yang nanti akan menjualnya ke distrik-distrik, dan mungkin ada beberapa orang yang dijelaskan seperti Prof. Rush, individual independent operators, or should we say eceran. Dan selain itu mungkin sempat ada hal menarik, pertanyaan tentang ganja, cannabis, yang menjadi, dan ini menjadi jawaban yang sangat menarik. Karena cannabis itu ada di seluruh wilayah di Asia Tenggara, dan Belanda tidak bisa memonopolinya, mungkin itu membuat Belanda tidak tertarik pada cannabis. Jadi produk yang menarik bagi Belanda adalah produk yang bisa mereka kendalikan dan mereka monopoli. Terlihat banget Belanda ini suka duit. Nah, pada suatu titik, Prof. Ras juga menjelaskan bahwa opium itu sangatlah legal di abad 20, tidak seperti sekarang. Jadi mereka yang jualan opium tidak melanggar hukum, sama kayak orang jualan rokok. Nah, pada akhirnya apa yang terjadi pada opium itu ya sama dengan apa yang terjadi pada rokok sekarang, dengan adanya teks.
Yes.
Lalu saat masuk kepada pembahasan tentang smuggling, ya ini memang ada di bukunya Prof. Rush, karena coastline of Java itu begitu besar, jadi susah untuk mengatur atau bukan membatasi, ya, memotong jalur smuggling di Jawa, karena kalau di Jawa Timur pun sudah kelihatan begitu banyak garis pantai. Jadi bayangkan saja mungkin Belanda akan kesusahan, bahkan mungkin kecolongan masalah smuggling. Nah, Prof. juga menjelaskan bahwa ketika Belanda datang, usually after they colonize somewhere, then the opium farming begins.
Yes.
Penjualan opium itu terjadi di semua wilayah yang mana Belanda itu sudah punya kekuasaan di sana, meskipun indirectly menjualnya. Mereka auction. Nah, there were parts of Java where opium was illegal. One of it was West Java, salah satunya di Jawa Barat yang ilegal di Priangan. Dan adalah ini, kalau tidak salah ada di bukunya, memang ada salah satu desa yang itu menolak untuk menjual opium. Nah, tapi kok kebetulan saya juga lupa ya kotanya. Nah, saat ada pertanyaan tentang Dutch, is there any Dutch who smoke opium or sold to Europeans? Mungkin hanya sedikit dari orang Belanda yang menyedot opium. Dan memang betul, kata Prof. Ras, ya, ini terkenal banget di beberapa buku bahwa orang Belanda itu peminum, pemabuk. Peminum mungkin ya, pemabuk.
Oh ya.
Peminum yang terkenal. Bahkan di bukunya Pram kan juga dijelaskan bagaimana ayahnya Annelies itu adalah pemabuk berat.
Oh yes, that they are.
Yeah. But what interesting is the French like opium. Di sini. Nah, untuk penutupan, Prof. Ras menjelaskan bahwa revenue farming dan opium farming berakhir pada mulai 1910 yang diawali dengan a big campaign untuk mengakhirinya pada tahun 1890-an ya, Prof. Ya. Pada akhirnya pemerintah Belanda meninggalkan opium farming. Nah, ini sebetulnya, this is interesting, sir. From indirect methods of governance to direct methods of governance. Nah, ini mungkin hal yang menarik buat kawan-kawan yang mau mengkaji entah sejarah atau mungkin administrasi publik. Ya, bagaimana perubahan dari metode yang tidak langsung dalam tata kelola pemerintahan menjadi metode yang langsung dalam tata kelola pemerintahan. Nah, setelah metode langsung ini, orang-orang bisa membeli opium langsung dari pemerintah. Dan setelah revolusi Indonesia, pemerintah yang pemerintah Indonesia yang baru tidak terlibat dalam praktek apapun di opium, perdagangan opium. Nah, menariknya sekarang kalau kita melihat berita, opium nampaknya tidak begitu terlihat di Indonesia karena didominasi oleh sabu dan pil. Dan jarang kita menemukan ada orang tertangkap karena menghisap opium. Mungkin menyuntik morfin ya, ada bentuk yang lebih baru. Nah, itu kesimpulan dari saya kawan-kawan. Terima kasih. Thank you very much, Professor James Rush. I hope we can have another discussion for another time.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining. That was a very excellent summary of our discussion. Thank you for that. Also, thank you for reading my book, and I hope we can meet again.
Ya.
Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih banyak, Pak.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you.